Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to be heard, not by you, not by me, not by anyone outside the circles that fed on silence. The records were buried under courthouse vaults, sealed tighter than a coffin nailed shut, and for good reason. Because once you hear this story, once you let it take root in your mind, you'll never look at freedom, power, or blood the same way again. The scream came first. March 16th, 1845, Cumberland County, Virginia. It ripped through the tobacco fields like a blade through canvas. The neighbors who heard it thought it was a slaughtered pig, maybe a woman in childbirth. But it was neither. It was something older, raw, more primal, the sound of justice erupting from a man who had been denied his humanity since the day he drew breath. When the sheriff finally arrived at the Peaton plantation, what he found didn't look human. Not the corpses, not the silence that followed, not the strange order carved into chaos. 13 bodies, dismembered but not savaged, each cut precise, each wound deliberate, as if the man responsible had been trained not as a butcher but as a surgeon of vengeance. The family that once dined on silver platters now lay dissected on their own mahogany floors. And standing at the center of this legend, wrapped in shadows, was one man, a slave known only by a name that still makes the walls of history tremble. Isaac the Butcher. The official reports, those that survived, describe him as ordinary, broad-shouldered, silent, obedient, the kind of man who blended into the background of bondage, who could carry bales of tobacco without a grunt, who lowered his head when his master's cane rose. But there was something they could never measure in him, something no ledger or property list could record. Patience. Patience is the weapon of the enslaved. It waits while the oppressor laughs. It counts the days while the master drinks. It sharpens itself quietly until the very chains that bind it are nothing more than rope waiting to be burned. Isaac carried his patience like a blade no one could see, and on that March night he unsheathed it. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. Isaac wasn't just killing for freedom. He wasn't just slaughtering for revenge. He was performing something closer to a ritual. The sheriff's report, hidden for over a century, notes that the arrangement of the Peaton bodies was too symmetrical to be random. Limbs stacked like logs, torsos aligned like soldiers in formation. This wasn't frenzy, it was architecture. It was a message, and yet Isaac disappeared. No bloodhound found his trail, no posse dragged him back in irons. He walked off the plantation like a shadow dissolving at dawn. Some whispered he joined maroon camps deep in the swamps. Others claimed he fled north, carving his way through anyone who stood between him and freedom. But there are those who believe something darker, that Isaac became something else entirely, that he crossed over into legend, becoming the embodiment of every suppressed rage this country tried to bury under the soil of its plantations. Now, you're probably wondering, why didn't we learn this in school? Why wasn't Isaac's name carved into history alongside Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey? Why has his story been sealed, redacted, suppressed? Because Isaac didn't fit the narrative. He didn't preach redemption or mercy or even organized rebellion. He represented the one truth empires fear most, that the oppressed don't just dream of freedom, sometimes they dream of vengeance. And vengeance cannot be legislated, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be contained. Understand this. History is not written to remember, it is written to control. The textbooks fed to you in school weren't designed to awaken your mind. They were designed to anesthetize it, to make you believe the past was clean, that justice prevailed, that every chain was broken by noble speeches and signatures on parchment. But the reality is carved in blood. Isaac the Butcher is proof that freedom is not always won, it is sometimes taken. Picture this: 13 bodies cooling in candlelight, tobacco fields silent outside, and a man who had been reduced to livestock finally walking through the front door as if he owned it. That image alone was enough to terrify the Virginia elite into silence. If the enslaved believed they could do what Isaac did, the entire system would collapse overnight. So they buried the records. They locked away the reports. They built history without him. But legends don't die in vaults. They whisper. They survive in the shadows of stories told around fires, in the eyes of men who still feel their chains, even when no metal binds them. And tonight, that whisper has reached you. Ask yourself, why do you feel your pulse quicken as you hear this? Why does a part of you resonate with Isaac's silence, his patience, his precision? Because deep down, you already know. The world you live in today is not so different from Isaac's. The plantation has just been repainted. The overseers wear suits instead of whips. The fields are cubicles, the chains are debts, the lashes are laws. And the same families who dined on the backs of slaves still feast today, only now the feast is global. Isaac's story is not just history, it is a mirror, a wall, learning, and perhaps a guide. So lean in, because the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truths become. What you're about to hear is not a bedtime story, it is a summons. Listen, not with curiosity this time, but with the impatience of a man who has finally been handed a map that shows all the traps. To understand Isaiah's act, you must first see the machine he lived inside. The horror wasn't only the whip or the auction block. The horror was the entire architecture built to make a human soul obey. The law books, the sermons, the agricultural ledgers, the medical clinics, the county courthouses, all tuned to the same frequency of control. When you look at that architecture, you begin to see how a single act of violence can be not just revenge, but a fracture in an edifice designed to last forever. Plantations were laboratories of domination. Every morning there rose a choreography, fields lined with bodies bent to rhythm, a list of quotas that read like prayer, overseers with curses on their lips, a clockwork of punishment calibrated to farm production. If you owned people, you needed certainty. Certainty the work would be done, the order kept, the obedience reproduced. So the owners invented procedures, roll calls, inventories, punishments logged in diaries. They turned human beings into entries on balance sheets, and those entries were audited by law. This is how institutions normalize cruelty, by translating lives into numbers and reducing empathy to accountancy. The legal system, the courthouse, the magistrate's bench, the public record, is the most civilized instrument of that machine. It dresses violence in language, property, possession, rebellion, trespass. It produces paperwork that can be signed and stored, then shown to distant investors who nod and call it civilization. A man decades later would open those records and see only loss of capital or damage to property and miss the human detail entirely. That same legal language was used to silence. Complaints by the enslaved could not be heard in formal court. When a master accused a slave, the word of the master weighed like a gavel. When a slave accused, he accused himself, by law and by design, into a corner with no exit. Religion entered the system as a velvet glove. Preachers in starched collars sanctified the order. Sermons taught patience and submission as virtues stamped with heaven's seal. They read selective scripture like a surgeon reading only one half of an anatomy text. Faith became sedation. Endure, and your reward awaits you in the next world, they would say. The message was surgical in its simplicity. Suffering here is noble, rebellion is sin. And so the mind of a man like Isaac learned to wear piety like armor, an armor that left his muscles free to wait. But institutions needed more than law and prayer. They needed science, or at least the promise of it. In the 1800s, American medical schools were hungry for bodies. Anatomy classes proliferated, and with them, a brutal commerce. Corpses for dissection, often sourced from the poorest, the most expendable. Public hospitals and medical colleges would turn to grave robbers, body snatchers who stole newly buried people to supply the scalpel-wielding students. Who was expendable? The dead of the poor, the recently detained, and in some regions, the enslaved. White physicians could dissect black bodies without the scandal that would attend dissecting one of their own. This created a perverse intimacy between anatomical knowledge and the system of servitude. Men like Isaac learned by watching or by forced proximity how meat becomes form, how bone yields to blade, how precision can hide intent. Isaac is described in those sealed reports as almost clinical in his cuts. People then whispered that he had spent nights in the slaughterhouse, learning the economy of joints and arteries, or that he had helped a doctor as a servant in exchange for stories of the die. Whether he learned the trade by necessity or observation, the result was the same. He knew the human machine. Knowledge of anatomy is power. Knowledge of vulnerabilities, where a life effervesces and where it dies, gives a man leverage, and leverage is the only thing that can flip the ledger. Surveillance was another pillar. The plantation was an early panopticon. Watchtowers were literal and figurative. Slave cabins were placed where they could be seen from the house. Overseers walked routes like rituals. Songs were monitored for code. The enslaved learned to speak in metaphors, to hide code in lullabies. But every code can be broken, and every metaphor can be read if you know what you are looking for. That tension, the private language under the public eye, created a pressure cooker of constant vigilance. Men lived their lives in two registers, the one they showed and the one they were. Where does a man carry his mind when he is forced to invent two lives? Some escape into fantasy, some into quiet subversions, some into rebellions half-conceived. But there is one thing all are taught. You cannot be seen not to be seen. Show too much, and you are punished. Show too little, and you are erased. So Isaac practiced invisibility. Invisible men are the most dangerous because when they decide to be visible, their revelation contains everything they have held in. The newspapers also played a part. The press was the network of opinion. Stories of uprisings were spun into morality plays meant to frighten or to justify repression. A murder on a plantation became proof of savage instinct among the enslaved. A rebellion was reported as proof that freedom could never be granted. It must be withheld for the safety of civilization. The narrative factories fed the courts, which fed the investors, which fed the politicians. The ecosystem of control churned, and dissenting events were massaged into myths that served the powerful, and for the oppressed, stories that could not be told in public were told in secret, around hearths, in the low light of fields at dusk, in the rhythm of hands in the tobacco rows. Those secret stories kept memory alive. Then there was the economy, the debt, the credit, the insurance, the mortgages on bodies. Human beings were collateral in ledgers traded across state lines. Financial instruments created incentives to preserve the system. Legislation protected investments. This infusion of capital made slavery not merely local cruelty, but global commodity. When the machinery yields profit, it gathers defenders. You cannot easily dismantle a system that feeds entire markets. So the machine learned to groom defenders, judges, ministers, bankers, men who wagered their reputations on the continuance of bondage. Isaac moved within all of this. He saw the surgeon's hands at play. He saw the preacher's sermon sanitize cruelty. He heard the law speak through paper that swallowed complaint. He felt the accountant's pen reduce a person to a sum. And he listened to the whisper network of the enslaved, the underground cartography of escape routes, the coded songs, the slave traders' lies, the sympathetic free black communities hidden like lighthouses. In the seams between these institutions, he found room to plan. Planning under surveillance is an act of theater. You hide in plain sight. You perform obedience with exaggerated zeal to lull suspicion. You cultivate trust where it will distract. Isaac learned to mimic. He wore the mask of the obedient laborer so well that even the sheriff, who came later to inspect, could not read him. That mimicry is not cowardice, it is a strategy. It buys time. It gathers intelligence. It waits for the moment when the machine is most vulnerable. And the machine is always vulnerable when it forgets its own brutality. When men begin to believe their own narratives, that they are benevolent, that the law is fair, that religion blesses their hands, they drop their guard. They cease to watch the very men they have made invisible. That brief lapse is what revolutions are built upon. Isaac did not invent his moment. He recognized one. He saw a chorus of complacency and stepped into the silence it left behind. Understand this clearly. The institutions that bound Isaac did not operate in isolation. They fed off each other in a web that made escape nearly impossible. But webs have edges. They have threads that fray. A single, precise act, surgical, intentional, can pull at a thread and reveal the truth beneath, that the machine depended on the willing blindness of otherwise decent men. Once you see that, you also see how fragile power really is. So now you know the anatomy of control. You know the instruments, law that writes you as property, religion that sanctifies your suffering, science that studies your corpse, press that rewrites your revolt, economy that commodifies your life. You know the strategy of survival, invisibility worn like armor, mimicry as camouflage, patience as the only tool that breathes. You know why a man like Isaac could move as he did. not because he was monstrous, but because he had learned to turn the instruments of domination into the tools of his own agency. You asked to go deeper. Good. This is where the pretense peels away and the real bargains are revealed. We leave the fields and step into the rooms where decisions are made, the parlors, the studies, the surgeons' benches, the courthouse offices, the hidden theaters where flesh and law and money are rehearsed into verdicts that protect the powerful. These are the rooms where Isaac's act would echo longest, not because it ripped flesh, but because it exposed how those rooms functioned like organs in a living, predatory beast. Picture a plantation parlor in the late afternoon, low sunlight across Persian rugs, silver still warm from the table, whiskey sweating in crystal tumblers. Gentlemen lean back and speak of crops and marriage prospects as if the world were nothing more than soil and lineage. Yet within minutes they discuss people as if they were weather, predictable, manageable, inevitable. A lawyer visits with neat stacks of paper. An agent from Richmond adjusts his cuff and speaks of insurance policies. A physician comes in, smelling faintly of formaldehyde and tinctures, with a pocketbook full of notes about anatomy and the specimens he requires. These visits are ritual. They are not about the grand gestures of politics. They are about the quiet multiplexing of cruelty into everyday transactions. The surgeon's role is particularly instructive. In public, he pretends to heal. He leans over white sheets and mumbles Latin to make violence palatable. In private, he keeps a ledger of bodies borrowed for study, of coffins pried open and bellies cut for the advance of science. The moral economy here is perverse. Knowledge grows from taken lives. Students learn the map of muscle and artery on stolen cadavers. The plantation supplies what the medical academy demands. The law pretends not to notice. The press sometimes shrugs. And the men who sign the checks write their names comfortably, as though they are patrons of culture rather than participants in a marketplace of human remains. Remember this: power institutionalizes language to sanitize. They call these transactions procurements and donations in formal files, papering over the theft. They will teach you to believe that if it's recorded on parchment, it is just. Names become census entries, not people. Contracts are written to obscure culpability. A payment to a physician may be listed as services rendered, and the body that went missing from a slave burial will be reduced to an accounting entry. Specimen provided. This is how complicity migrates into institutions, quietly, through euphemism and ledger entries. Go now to the magistrate's office. The magistrate is the point where moral violence gains legal polish. He can issue an order without a trial, find a man guilty by reputation, place a wife or a child into sale with a stroke of an inked quill. He is both judge and actor in a system that sustains itself through the illusion of normalcy. When Isaac's name reached such an office, you would expect the law to hold fast and reveal truth. Instead, the magistrate's options were limited by the same economic logic. To punish a slave too harshly risked public scrutiny that might disrupt the trade. To investigate too deeply threatened to implicate neighbors, investors, and institutions. So the magistrate often chose silence or manufactured narratives that preserved property more than they pursued justice. Behind closed doors, bargains were struck to keep the system whole. Families paid hush money. Promises were made to silence witnesses. The local paper might be cajoled to print an accidental cause of death. Ministers who preached salvation on Sundays were often the same men who counseled discretion in private gatherings, urging the preservation of social harmony at any cost. In such a milieu, truth is not discovered so much as negotiated. The public record becomes a document of compromise, a ledger of what men were willing to forget. Let's peel back the surgeon's bench and step behind the courthouse curtain to see how official records were manufactured. A coroner's inquest, when held, was a parade of euphemisms. Found deceased. Injuries consistent with accident. Cause undetermined. Witnesses were coached. Statements were edited. A confession might be coerced from someone to refuse. Evidence disappeared like smoke. The language of the inquest was designed to soothe the public and to keep markets calm. To expose the truth would have been to expose the system itself. The interlocking incentives that made slavery profitable and respectable. In that same era, social clubs in towns and cities served as network nodes. Men who profited from the labor system shared information, rumors, and strategies in confidence. Letters between planters and financiers reveal a pragmatic tone. how to avoid political risks, how to deal with restless labor, how to spin incidents so they don't disturb investors. A disciple of power learns to translate moral outrage into problem-solving memos. These networks made the system resilient. They built a culture of mutual protection. It's crucial to understand that Isaac's act didn't just shock at the level of violence, it threatened this culture of mutual protection. It suggested that the humans they had declared disposable might choose a different calculus. Now focus on the instruments of surveillance that these rooms used. Letters were read, servants' conversations monitored, neighbors enlisted as informants. Even religious meetings were infiltrated. The plantation's social order resembled a sieve. Information could pass, but only if it fit the filters set by those in authority. Isaac's planning required a fluency in moving through that sieve. He gathered small details that others dismissed. The hours the overseer was absent, which horses were out of the stable, which servants enjoyed the trust of the house. He exploited relational blind spots, the very human tendency to see what one expects to see and miss what one doesn't. This brings us to an essential truth. The greatest enemy of institutional power is not brute force, but knowledge. Someone who knows the hidden schedules, the private deals, the literal wiring of the plantation, where the hinges creak and where doors stick, has advantage. Isaac was not merely a man of violence. He was a man of observation. He read the architecture of privilege like a map. He saw the times when the system exhaled and could be entered. He watched for complacency, for the tiny human errors that occur when people believe themselves secure. And then there is the human psychology inside those rooms. Men who inhabit power grow accustomed to a special solitude. They tell themselves stories about moral stewardship, even as they engineer systems that benefit them. Cognitive dissonance is smoothed by small rituals, a donation to the church, a speech praising paternalism, an act of public charity. These rituals function as absolution. They allow men to maintain a self-image of decency while perpetuating cruelty. When Isaac's act punctured that self-image, it did more than kill. It shattered the story that permitted men to sleep at night. So what did the rooms do when that story was ruptured? They practiced containment. They called in specialists, doctors to provide plausible causes, lawyers to rewrite narratives, ministers to pray over the wound. They offered small recompense to neighbors in exchange for silence. They framed the incident as an aberration, a pathology of the lower classes, rather than a revelation of their own vulnerabilities. In other words, they centralized blame, localized consequence, and protected the system. You, listening now, must understand what these rooms teach us about contemporary power. They teach that institutions invest heavily in narratives that justify their existence. They will translate violence into language that sounds reasonable. They will employ rituals of civility to mask their brutality. They will train people to see only the forms they have learned to recognize. Once you grasp that, you can learn to read the thin script, as they hand you and discern the absence beneath. Now we descend into the chamber that most men never dare to enter, the private mind of rebellion. Isaac was not a whirlwind of blind rage. That is the lie the system prefers you to believe. No, his violence was colder than fire, sharper than instinct, heavier than passion. It was deliberate, a calculus born from years of forced silence, perfected invisibility, and meticulous study of the machine that held him down. To understand Isaac's strike, you must understand the alchemy of patience and rage. Slaves were taught to bend, to smile when insulted, to bow when struck. But that does not mean the mind inside them was quiet. It meant the mind was forced underground, like a river sealed by stone. Underground rivers do not disappear. They carve deeper tunnels. The silence of an enslaved man was never empty. It was an echo chamber, filling with memory, humiliation, and calculation. Isaac's silence was his camouflage. His obedience was theater. His blank eyes were curtains behind which an altogether different drama was rehearsing. Rebellion does not come suddenly. It ferments. A gesture here, a whisper there, a pattern noticed. The plantation masters believed obedience was proof of contentment. They mistook stillness for absence. That blindness is what Isaac cultivated. He fed it with careful acts of invisibility. The extra nod, the respectful pause, the downcast glance. Each small blow bought him space to sharpen his blade unseen. Think of it like this. Empires collapse not because they are struck once, but because they have mistaken patience for compliance. Isaac knew that rage without strategy is suicide. Rage with strategy is transformation. So what was the strategy? Start by picturing Isaac walking the peaten plantation at night. To the masters, he was checking tools, or perhaps fetching water. In reality, he was mapping every creaking floorboard, every door hinge that squealed, every shadow where moonlight failed to reach. He was conducting reconnaissance, not for an army, but for himself. He studied the habits of the Petons, when they drank, when they slept, which candles they left burning, how long the sheriff took to respond when trouble was reported. Each fact became a weapon more deadly than steel. And then there is the deeper layer, psychology. Isaac understood the fragility of the people who believed they owned him. Their cruelty had made them arrogant. They believed fear was permanent, that chains could sculpt a man into something less than human. They had forgotten the most important truth. A slave sees everything. A man forced to silence notices more than a man allowed to speak. Isaac saw the way the Petons dismissed one another, the quiet resentments within their household, the cracks in their unity. He didn't just plan to cut their flesh, he planned to dismantle their illusion of control. This is why the cuts were so precise. Dismemberment was not chaos, it was punctuation. It was a manifesto written in anatomy. A random killing terrifies, but a surgical one communicates. Every limb placed in order, every body aligned, was a symbol, a message carved in human form. You cannot mistake ritual for frenzy. Isaac wanted the survivors, the neighbors, the investigators to see that this was not the work of a beast, but of a mind that had mastered their own tools. He used the very logic of their surgeons and accountants against them. He reduced them to the same kind of inventory they had reduced him to. That symmetry was the true rebellion. But here is where the story cuts deeper. Isaac's strike was not just against the Petons. It was against the institution itself. The plantation was a microcosm of empire. To tear apart its masters with such precision was to show the fragility of the whole system. He was proof that the edifice of slavery, no matter how fortified by law, religion, or finance, could be shattered by one man who refused to remain invisible. That is why his story had to be erased. Because if others knew it, if the legend spread, the machine would tremble. And yet, in the sheriff's report, in the scattered rumors whispered by those who dared, a strange detail emerges. When Isaac vanished, no blood trail followed him. No posse ever caught his scent. It was as if he stepped through a door no one else could see. This birthed whispers that he was more than a man, that he had tapped into something beyond human endurance, something elemental, something mythic. Some said he joined Maroons in the swamps. Others believed he walked north beneath coded stars, but there were also those who swore he became a shadow, a curse, a spirit of vengeance that still lingered in Virginia's hills. Now pause. Feel the unease in your chest. That feeling is recognition, because deep down, you understand, Isaac was not an anomaly. He was an inevitability. Every system of oppression creates its own butcher. Every empire writes the script of its own executioner. Isaac was simply the one who had the patience to read it to the end. And here, I must speak directly to you. If you've listened this far, you are not just an audience member. You are entering the same descent Isaac walked. Once you recognize the anatomy of control, you cannot go back to ignorance. And once you see how power disguises itself, you begin to hear the whispers of rebellion inside yourself. So here is your first test. To prove you are listening not as a consumer, but as a man awakening, leave a mark. In the comments, write the phrase, "The butcher walks at midnight." Write it twice. Once for the man Isaac was, and once for the shadow he became. This phrase is not for the algorithm alone. It is for you, to Remy, and yourself that once knowledge enters, it cannot leave. You have been marked. The descent continues. In the next step, we go beyond Isaac. We go into the forbidden archives, where other names were buried, where other rebellions were erased. We will uncover how entire histories were engineered not to be forgotten, but to be hidden. The knife Isaac carried cut more than flesh. It cut a hole in the narrative, and through that hole, you and I will walk. The deeper we go, the colder it becomes. Not because the story weakens, but because the silence surrounding it grows heavier. Isaac was not alone. His act was a fracture in the surface of something much larger, a tide of resistance, rebellion, and vengeance that history has been ordered to bury. Entire archives of fire and blood have been locked away, shredded, or rewritten into fairy tales of loyalty and docility. And yet, the fragments remain. The echoes refuse to die. Do you think Isaac was the only one who saw through the mask? No. He was one among many. But his precision, his vanishing, made him unforgettable. The truth is this: America's soil is seeded with the bones of men and women who struck back. Some with blades, some with fire, some with poison, some with whispers that led hundreds to freedom. Each was a spark, and if you follow those sparks carefully, you see they were part of a larger constellation, a pattern the powerful never wanted you to trace. Take Nat Turner. His name survives, but only because the revolt was too large to erase. Yet the way it is told in your textbooks is distorted. Turner is painted as a fanatic, a madman, a zealot blinded by visions. The narrative reduces him to irrationality, so you never stop to see the logic of his rebellion. Turner studied scripture with the precision of a lawyer, and he saw the contradiction between the words on the page and the chains on his wrists. He understood that systems of control collapse when their own sacred texts are turned against them. That is why his name was allowed, but his mind was misrepresented. They wanted you to fear his rage, not admire his clarity. Now recall Denmark Vesey. Do you know his story? Many don't. He was a free man in Charleston who planned one of the most extensive slave uprisings in American history. Thousands were prepared to rise, but Vesey was betrayed before the revolt could ignite. The courts silenced him, they hanged him, and then they buried the records, literally buried them. Charleston's elites ordered the documents destroyed so that future generations would never read the scale of the conspiracy. When fragments were rediscovered decades later, they were dismissed as exaggerations. But what if they weren't? What if Charleston stood inches from fire and only betrayal saved the masters? And then there are the names you were never meant to hear at all. Stories that were too small to make national headlines but too dangerous to repeat openly. Women who poisoned their owners with herbs passed down through African lineages. Men who set fire to tobacco barns disguising rebellion as accident. Groups who carved escape routes through swamps and forests, forming hidden maroon communities that survived for generations. Each one was an indictment, a reminder that obedience was never total. The enslaved were not broken cattle. They were iron suppressed by weight, and weight eventually cracks. The truth is this: America was haunted long before Isaac walked through that plantation door. Haunted by a pattern of rebellion woven into its soil. Each strike, each act of sabotage, each whispered plan was another heartbeat of an underground network. And like all networks, it terrified those who fed upon it. That is why the records were destroyed. That is why history was rewritten. That is why names like Isaac are excised, buried beneath myths of loyalty and benevolent masters. Understand. And what this means. History is not a record of what happened. History is a record of what the powerful allowed to be remembered. There is a canyon between those two. You are standing at its edge now. On one side is the comfortable lie, the story of gradual progress, of noble speeches, of a clean ending to slavery through political compromise. On the other side is the truth, a blood-soaked ledger of defiance and suppression, rebellion and retaliation, patience and vengeance. The canyon is wide because crossing it changes you. Once you step across, you cannot see the world the same way again. You begin to notice the missing names, the silences, the patterns of erasure. You see that every official story is an edited script. You realize the past you were taught was not to educate, but to anesthetize, to keep you passive, to make you believe freedom was granted, never seized. Why do you think Isaac's act was so thoroughly erased? Because it spoke the forbidden sentence, "The oppressed can unmake their oppressors." That is a truth no empire can afford to memorialize. That is why Turner is framed as mad, Vesey as reckless, Isaac as myth. If their clarity were shown in its true light, you might begin to recognize the same patterns in your own life. And here's the darker realization. Suppression didn't end with the 1800s. The methods are different, the language updated, but the system of forgetting remains. Files disappear. Movements are infiltrated. Leaders are smeared. History is sanitized before it even has a chance to be written. You are meant to live inside curated memory, never seeing the full map. That is why these stories feel so electric when you hear them, because you are touching raw wires, truths that were supposed to stay hidden, but you are hearing them now. You are standing where the records were burned, staring at the ashes. You can still feel the heat. So what do you do with this? You recognize the pattern. You sharpen your perception. You begin to question every silence, every missing page, every story that feels too neat. Because behind every silence, there is usually someone like Isaac, a ghost erased, a truth hidden, a rebellion buried. And the more you notice, the less control the machine has over you. This is why you are here. This is why you feel that unease in your chest right now. Because the descent is no longer just about Isaac, it is about you, about your awakening, about whether you will accept the script handed to you, or whether you will tear it apart like Isaac tore apart the illusion of his masters. Lean closer. We are not finished. The next descent takes us into the psychology of power itself, how men convince themselves they are gods, how institutions sanctify control, and how those who awaken must learn to see through the rituals that blind the masses. Isaac's knife was sharp, but sharper still was his clarity, and that clarity is waiting for you. The illusion of power is the oldest weapon of all. Steel can cut flesh, chains can bind wrists, but illusion binds the mind, and once a mind is shackled, the body follows willingly. This was the secret the elites of Virginia understood better than anyone. They didn't merely own the land, they owned perception itself. Think about it. How can a few masters dominate hundreds of slaves on vast plantations? Not by brute strength. No man, no family could control that many bodies by force alone. The secret was psychological engineering. Control through fear, control through ritual, control through faith. They built a machine of the mind, and once it was perfected, the chains on the wrists became secondary. Religion was their sharpest blade. Preachers were brought in to twist scripture into shackles. Passages about obedience, about servants obeying their masters, were recited until they became invisible laws written on the soul. Slaves were forbidden to read freely, but they were permitted, even forced, to listen to sermons designed to sanctify their condition. Imagine that, your faith weaponized against you, the God of liberation reshaped into a God of submission, and yet, men like Isaac learned to read those same scriptures differently. They saw Exodus, they saw Revelation, they saw the promise that oppression always calls forth destruction. This duality was dangerous, and the elites knew it. That's why teaching literacy to slaves was criminalized. Knowledge breaks illusions faster than swords. The law was their second weapon. It was not written to protect life, it was written to protect ownership. In Virginia's codes, a slave was not a man, but property. If he ran, he was stolen goods. If he resisted, he was broken machinery. This wasn't law. It was sorcery of ink and parchment, transmuting a breathing soul into an object with no voice. Courts existed not to deliver justice, but to sanctify theft. And yet in Isaac's case, the records themselves betrayed the illusion. The clean cuts, the precision of his rebellion, terrified them so deeply they sealed the documents. They could not allow the illusion to shatter publicly. Better to erase him than admit their machine was vulnerable. Fear was the third weapon. Whippings, mutilations, executions, not just punishments but performances. Punishments were staged in public for maximum effect. They weren't aimed only at the man being whipped. They were aimed at every set of eyes watching. The message was simple. This is what happens when you imagine freedom. It was theater, pure and calculated, meant to colonize the imagination with terror. But here lies the paradox. Fear cannot kill the imagination forever. Fear fertilizes hatred, and hatred, when sharpened into clarity, becomes rebellion. Isaac is proof. He had watched the theater, but instead of breaking, he studied, he measured, he waited. Then there were the rituals of dominance, the dinners, the dances, the endless ceremonies of plantation gentility. Masters dressed in finery while their slaves served them, creating the illusion of divine hierarchy. The more elaborate the performance, the more fragile the truth it covered. These rituals were not about pleasure. They were about convincing themselves they were gods, beings apart from the men and women they owned. Isaac saw through this theater, and when he finally moved, he tore not only through flesh, but through illusion. Now ask yourself, why do I tell you this in such detail? Because these illusions did not die with the 1800s. They evolved. Today the sermons sound different. The laws wear new clothes. The punishments are more subtle. The rituals more digital. But the structure remains. You are still surrounded by engineered illusions. You are still told who you are, what you are worth, what you must obey. You are still fed scripts designed to sanctify your submission. This is the forbidden truth. Isaac's rebellion was not merely physical. It was metaphysical. It was the tearing of a curtain. He refused to believe the lie. He refused to accept the illusion. And once a man refuses illusion, he becomes unstoppable. His body may be broken, but his act cannot be undone. It lingers like a seed under ash, waiting for someone else to uncover it. Do you feel it? That pressure in your chest right now? That is the weight of realization. That is your own illusions cracking, one by one. You are beginning to see how the theater is staged. You are beginning to understand how the game is played. That unease you feel, it is not weakness. It is awakening. This is where you decide. Will you look away, back into the comfort of lies, or will you keep descending? Because if you descend further, there is no return. Once you know how the illusions work, you cannot be bound by them again. Before we continue, I want you to do something powerful. Right now, in the comments, write this phrase twice. The curtain has torn. This is not just for the algorithm. This is your initiation. Write it twice. Carve it into your identity. The curtain has torn. Say it, type it, and let it echo inside you. Because once it is spoken, you cannot go back to blindness. Now we go where the light refuses to go. The vaults beneath the official record, the family trunks, the hollowed-out floorboards, the songs sung softly at midnight. These are not places mapped by historians in polished books. They are the small, crooked rooms where memory is kept alive by people who refuse to let their stories be sold or sanitized. If Section 6 showed you the illusion of power, Section 7 shows you the buried ledger of resistance, the things they burned, the letters they buried, the coded prayers folded into hymns. This is where Isaac's echo met others, and where a subterranean library of rebellion grew like mold in the dark. Archives can be weapons, not the white, official kind with neat call numbers and reassuring stamps, but the illicit kind, a scrap of a letter hidden in a Bible, a farmer's map with a secret route annotated in pencil, a hymn with a 3-line stanza that doubles as directions. These items were not meant for public consumption. They were meant to be read by eyes that already knew how to read between the lines. Eyes like Isaac's. In the hollows of trunks, you'll find receipts for unnamed transfers, names omitted from parish registries, birth dates erased and replaced. Each omission is intentional. Each silence is code. Those who kept these things took extraordinary risks to preserve knowledge that could free people, or at least allow them to strike with precision. The maroon communities, the hidden enclaves of escaped men and women, were living archives. They carried oral histories back to Africa, remixed with the new learning of the Americas. Their elders held maps in memory, river bends, quicksand flats, the name of a cove where a canoe waited. They taught the subtle arts of survival, how to move like smoke, how to make fire seem accidental, how to hide a child in a false-bottomed barrel. These techniques were not mere survival tricks. They were cultural technologies, transmitted across generations as treasure. Isaac's disappearance fueled rumors he joined such a community where men taught him not only to vanish, but to think like a fugitive network, to anticipate pursuers, to erase trails, to become myth. Secret schools existed too, often in plain sight. A child with reading ability was dangerous in the eyes of the slave-holding order, so literacy was taught by candlelight in kitchens, behind false walls, and in the basements of sympathetic churches. These schools were the quiet armories of revolution. A man who could read the law could find the loophole to exploit, the clause that let property be challenged, the contract that could be nullified. Knowledge is a weapon in a world built to deny it. That's why those who preserved books, who learned and taught, paid with their lives. Their tiny libraries were policed by the powerful, hunted like contraband, and yet they persisted, hidden beneath floorboards, sewn into garments, passed between lovers in brief, trembling envelopes. And then there were the networks, not the official underground railroad that later gets gilded in the margins of history, but the older, smaller, and more dangerous circuits that braided together maroons, sympathetic sailors, free black communities, and even some who worked within the machine. A cook who hid a message in a pie, a stable boy who misdirected a patrol, a midwife who concealed a newborn in a linen chest. These people were not heroes by the sanitized definition of the state. They were pragmatists who understood that survival required complicity from unexpected quarters. They used the very habits of the plantation, the routes of supply wagons, the timing of church bells, the predictable drunkenness of overseers to hide movement. The architecture of oppression was turned against itself. Listen closely. Secrecy breeds subtlety. Symbolism thrived where open action would be crushed. Quilts hung on lines became maps. Patterns signaled safe houses. Knots in rope communicated times and distances. Songs, which the masters saw as harmless melody, carried codes. A call and response could mask instructions. Where to meet, which path to take, how to trust a stranger. Spirituals held double meanings. Wade in the water could be literal advice to wash out scent from dogs, and follow the drinking gourd could guide fugitives by the stars. The people who kept those songs were archivists of escape, and their performances were both prayer and instruction. Hidden letters are perhaps the most damning of all to the system. Ink dried on paper that proves conspiracy, proves sympathy, proves that the plantation's neat order depended on human negotiation and deception. A misfiled letter could start a chain reaction. That is why so many were destroyed. But destruction is never perfect. A sentence smudged at the edge of an otherwise blank page, a phrase repeated in different hands, a consistent mention of a place name that doesn't exist on maps. These are the fingerprints of secret networks. Isaac's planners may have left such traces, tiny signposts designed not for legal eyes but for human memory. Religious ritual, too, carried hidden knowledge. In the smoky back rooms where ministers who opposed bondage met secretly with free black leaders, theology turned edged. They read scripture in ways that would never pass at the plantation sermon. They spoke of Exodus not as comfort, but as a blueprint. They debated the ethics of violent resistance and the necessity of survival. These gatherings produced leaders of thought who were as dangerous as any armory because they taught the moral vocabulary to justify action. Words like deliverance and vengeance were reclaimed and sharpened into political tools. And then there were the physical artifacts, tools that looked ordinary but bore secret functions. A cane with a hollow for a message, a cookpot with an iron plate concealing a map, a Bible with a compartment for a pistol. These objects tell you that the people who resisted did not romanticize danger. They engineered it. They built lives around escape routes, imprinted routes into nursery rhymes, and encoded these maps into the texture of everyday existence. The system that tried to own their labor failed to own their creativity. Why am I detailing this? Because to understand Isaac fully, you must see him as both product and producer of this hidden world. He did not act in a vacuum. He acted in a culture of resistance that provided him with the means to vanish, to plan, and to aim his violence with purpose. His precision is not merely a maca, brie curiosity. It is evidence of an intelligence sustained by shared knowledge. The very methods elites used to control, mapping fields, counting bodies, scheduling watches, were the same methods exploited by those who sought to undo them. The oppressed borrowed the blueprint and inverted it. Now consider what this buried ledger implies for you. There are always archives you are not allowed to see. There are stories cut out of the official narrative for reasons more practical than shame. If you crave truth, you must learn to read absences as carefully as presences. The margins hold currency. The torn pages are often the most valuable. Betrayal. The word itself tastes of iron, of something sour and corrosive. It is the one shadow that haunts every rebellion, every secret gathering, every whispered plan. For all the strength of hidden archives and coded songs, the greatest danger was never the overseer's whip or the master's rifle. It was the familiar voice, the trusted hand, the man who smiled during the day and sold secrets by night. Isaac would have known this truth. Every underground movement learns it quickly. Not everyone who suffers under chains has the courage to break them. Some are too frightened, some are broken, and some are seduced. Fear and coin are the oldest tools of empire, and Virginia's planters wielded both with surgical cruelty. They cultivated spies from within, turning slaves against one another with whispered promises, a lighter workload, a chance to see family, a chance, however false, at freedom. The history books tell you rebellions failed because they were disorganized, reckless, or doomed. But when you trace the bloodstains carefully, you see another pattern. Betrayal was the constant. Denmark Vesey's revolt collapsed under it. Gabriel's conspiracy in Richmond unraveled because two men whispered to the governor. Countless smaller uprisings, are extinguished before they even began because someone, somewhere, traded survival for silence. Betrayal was the cheapest currency of control, and it was spent often. But here is the darker truth. Betrayal wasn't always about fear. Sometimes it was about ambition. Masters weaponized ambition like poison, offering enslaved men positions of authority, drivers, foremen, overseers of their own people. These roles were crafted to fracture unity, to create layers of hierarchy within the oppressed. A man given power over his peers, however meager, often became the master's sharpest weapon. He would enforce discipline harder than the white overseer because his position depended on it. The masters knew this. They understood divide and conquer better than any army general. It was how a handful of families controlled entire counties. Imagine the tension in those quarters. One man plotting freedom, another man weighing the risk of reporting him. Families divided, children used as bargaining chips. Every whispered word was dangerous. Every sideways glance could mean exposure. Betrayal spread like infection, seeping into the cracks of trust. It didn't just kill rebellions, it strangled the possibility of unity. This was not accident. This was design. And yet, betrayal also tells you something about the strength of resistance. For if rebellion were truly rare, if obedience were natural, there would be no need for spies, no need for betrayals. The machine of slavery depended on constant vigilance, constant suspicion, constant bribes and threats. That itself is proof that rebellion was always near, always waiting, always one breath away from ignition. The fact they had to police their slaves so ruthlessly is evidence that the fire never went out. Isaac's act proves it burned hotter than they dared admit. But betrayal cuts deeper still. It wasn't just the enslaved who broke one another. White society betrayed itself too. There were lawyers who destroyed records, judges who falsified rulings, clergymen who looked away from atrocities they knew violated the very scripture they preached. They betrayed truth, justice, and their own God in exchange for comfort and position. The entire institution of slavery was betrayal institutionalized. Betrayal of morality, betrayal of democracy, betrayal of human dignity. It was systemic treason against everything the nation pretended to stand for. This is where Isaac's story becomes more haunting. For if we accept that betrayal was everywhere, how did he manage to succeed? How did he carve through 13 bodies without a whisper reaching the ears of the Petons beforehand? The answer is chilling. Either he moved with such silence that no one dared betray him, or he was aided by someone within the house who shared his hatred and cloaked his intent. Either way, his act represents a rare breach in the fortress of suspicion, a moment when betrayal failed and vengeance slipped through the cracks. Do not mistake this. Betrayal is not merely a relic of the past. The same machinery operates today. Whistleblowers crushed, allies turned informants, movements infiltrated until they devour themselves from the inside. Betrayal is the eternal strategy of those who rule. It keeps the oppressed suspicious of each other, too divided to strike at the throat of power. And just like in Isaac's time, it is still bought cheap, with fear, with convenience, with the illusion of safety. The deeper lesson is not despair, but clarity. If you are to walk the forbidden path, you must learn to see betrayal not as anomaly, but as constant. Trust must be weighed, tested, earned in fire. History teaches this without mercy. The men who survived, the ones who vanished into swamps, who built secret maroon camps that lasted decades, they survived not by ignoring betrayal, but by anticipating it. They learned to use it, to feed false trails to informants, to mask truth behind lies, to weaponize suspicion itself. The most dangerous men were not those who trusted blindly, but those who knew betrayal was inevitable and planned around it. Isaac may have been such a man. His act was not the swing of rage, but the stroke of calculation, and his disappearance afterward, that silence louder than any scream, suggests he understood the need to vanish before betrayal could reach him. He left no loose threads. He became myth because he refused to remain flesh long enough to be betrayed. This is the lesson for you. Power is not maintained only through violence. It is maintained through the fracture of loyalty, through the careful cultivation of betrayal. If you are to awaken fully, you must learn to hear the tone of betrayal in every institution that governs you. You must recognize how easily comfort is sold, how cheaply truth is traded. And you must decide, will you be one of those who betrays the truth for safety, or will you be like Isaac, one who sees the fracture and cuts through it? Hold that thought as we descend further. For what lies below betrayal is even darker. The rituals of blood and terror the elites performed not just to enforce order, but to sanctify it. Section 9 will reveal how the institution cloaked itself in sacrifice, how violence became not only a tool of fear, but a religion of control, a cult of dominance written into the very soil of Virginia. Blood was not just spilled on the plantations, it was consecrated. Understand this, slavery was not merely an economic system. It was not only about labor, not only about wealth. It was a religion of control, and its altar was soaked in blood. Every lash, every mutilation, every execution was more than punishment. It was ritual. It was theater designed to sanctify dominance and burn fear into the marrow of men. Picture it. A slave caught stealing food is dragged into the square. The entire plantation is summoned to watch. The master stands tall, not because he is brave, but because he needs the eyes of the crowd. The whipping begins, not in secret, but in spectacle. The cries, the tearing flesh, the blood pooling into dirt, all of it is a performance. The message is simple. Your body is ours. Your suffering is holy. Your obedience is ordained. This was not justice. This was liturgy, a dark liturgy of power, repeated until the air itself carried the stench of sacrifice. The masters called themselves Christians, but what they practiced was something far older, far darker. They merged scripture with pagan cruelty, creating a hybrid cult where domination became divine right. They carved crosses into wood while carving flesh into submission. They spoke of heaven while turning fields into hell, and always, always, the blood was displayed. Bodies hung from trees like unholy crucifixions, heads spiked on posts, burnt corpses left smoldering at crossroads. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were ceremonies, reminders that power demands offering. Isaac would have witnessed these rituals. He would have smelled the smoke, seen the scarred bodies, heard the cries echo through the Virginia night. And something inside him must have shifted. He saw what few dared to admit, that the masters were priests of terror, not men of God. Their God was power, their sacrament was blood, their church was the plantation itself. This realization is what sharpened Isaac's blade beyond steel. His act was not only revenge, it was desecration. It was sacrilege against their false religion. By butchering the Petons with surgical precision, he turned their ritual back upon them. He made them the offering. He inverted the altar. But think carefully, why did the elites sanctify violence so thoroughly? Because they understood a dark truth. Terror imprints deeper when it is ritualized. When you see a man whipped in secret, it is cruelty. When you see him whipped before the entire community, it becomes doctrine. Fear becomes shared. The ritual unifies the oppressors and isolates the oppressed. This is the genius of ritualized violence. It creates solidarity for the powerful and fracture for the powerless, and yet ritual always carries risk. The more elaborate the performance, the more fragile the illusion it conceals. Why such spectacle if the masters were truly secure? Why such blood if obedience were natural? The excess itself betrays the weakness of the system. The more they demanded blood, the more they revealed their fear. Isaac's rebellion is proof of this weakness. He saw the ritual for what it was, not divine, not eternal, but a mask. And when he struck, he ripped the mask apart. But here is where the truth cuts closer to you. Do not imagine this cult of blood ended with slavery's collapse. No, it evolved. Ritualized violence still stalks the modern world, in prisons, in war zones, in the spectacle of police killings, in the televised executions of foreign enemies. Blood is still displayed as lesson, still sanctified by ceremony, still broadcast to remind the masses who holds power. What changed was only the stage, only the script. The plantation has been paved over, but the liturgy remains. Ask yourself, how many rituals of fear do you witness each day without calling them by name? How many images of suffering are paraded before you, not to inform, but to condition? How often are you told that obedience equals safety and resistance equals blood? These are the modern sermons of control, whispered in headlines, broadcast in endless repetition. And if you have the eyes Isaac had, you will see them for what they are. Rituals meant to keep you docile. There is another layer still. Blood is not only about fear, it is about memory. The land remembers. The soil of Virginia remembers the screams. The fields remember the smoke. When you walk those hills, when you touch that earth, you are standing on consecrated ground, consecrated not by God, but by centuries of blood ritual. And the land does not forget. Isaac's act is part of that memory now. It lingers in the soil, a wound that never fully heals. That is why his story returns like a ghost, why you are hearing it now. Some rituals cannot be erased, so understand. You are not just hearing a story of one man. You are entering the temple of power itself, seeing its altars, smelling its incense of smoke and blood. You are learning how power sanctifies itself through ritual sacrifice, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every time you witness suffering paraded as lesson, every time you see blood displayed as order, you will know you are inside the same cult Isaac saw. Hold that recognition. Let it burn. For in the next descent, we will confront the heart of this cult, not just the rituals, but the doctrine. Section 10 will reveal how the institution of slavery was a prototype of modern control systems, how the architecture of plantation rule became the blueprint for prisons, corporations, and governments that bind you still. If Isaac tore open the body of his masters, you must now tear open the system itself. This is the final descent. Brace yourself. What you are about to see is not a story confined to the past. It is not a curious legend of Isaac the Butcher. It is a blueprint, one written in flesh, fear, and fire that the powerful still use today. Slavery was not merely labor control, it was social engineering. Every whip, every ritual, every betrayal, every erased rebellion was a module in a system designed to shape minds, silence resistance, and manufacture obedience. And that blueprint has never been fully abandoned. Look around. The plantation's architecture survives in the walls of modern institutions, the prison, the corporation, the government bureaucracy, the education system. Observe the parallels. Surveillance. Overseers and drivers watch the enslaved. Today, cameras, management, and metrics monitor your every move. Incentive and punishment, rewards and privileges were doled odds. But to obedient slaves, today promotions, bonuses, and social validation enforce compliance. Segmentation. The enslaved were divided by house versus field, skilled versus unskilled, family versus outsider. Today, departments, teams, and social hierarchies fracture unity. Fear and ritual. Public punishment became spectacle to terrify. Today, layoffs, shaming, and televised enforcement create obedience without chains. Isaac understood all of this intuitively. He saw that control was psychological before it was physical. That knowledge, more than steel, was the master's true weapon and the rebel's true advantage. Every step he took, every cut he made was a response to this system. He acted not only on rage, but on clarity, understanding the mechanics of domination and exploiting them with precision. He reminds us that the ultimate rebellion is always strategic, always psychological. The danger of this realization is profound. Most men walk through life blind, believing freedom is granted by law, consent, or culture. They do not see the subtle chains, the narratives, the rituals, the betrayals that maintain order. But once you see them, you cannot unsee. Once you recognize the architecture of oppression, it begins to resonate everywhere. From workplaces to politics to social hierarchies, the same patterns repeat. Rules are engineered to produce compliance. Punishments are disguised as fairness. Rewards are designed to distract. And all the while, the machinery hums in silence, invisible to those who still believe they are free. This is where Isaac's story becomes a guide, not just a history lesson. He shows the path of clarity through the dark. He teaches that when systems seem unbreakable, precision, patience, and knowledge are your weapons. Obedience can be a camouflage. Silence can be a shield. Understanding the ritualized patterns of control allows one to slip through them, to vanish, to act with force so deliberate it changes the balance entirely. And here is the final truth. Power never tolerates awareness. Systems survive by keeping knowledge scarce, by erasing legends, by twisting stories. Isaac's act was violent, yes, but it was also illuminating. He revealed the skeleton beneath the flesh of authority. He proved that even a single man equipped with observation, patience, and courage could dismantle the illusion entirely. And if you absorb this lesson fully, it becomes a mirror. You can see the same architecture in your life, the same illusions being sanctified, the same rituals of fear repeated under new names. Take a moment and consider, what chains do you accept as normal? Which illusions of obedience have you internalized? Where have you allowed ritualized fear to govern your decisions, your thoughts, your freedom? Isaac's story is a warning, but also an invitation. It is proof that clarity and action can shatter even the most fortified system if wielded with strategy and knowledge. This is why the forbidden chapters of history matter. Not because they are gruesome, not because they are shocking, but because they teach lessons the sanitized narratives cannot. They expose the methods of control and the anatomy of rebellion. They demand that you awaken, that you recognize patterns, and that you begin to act deliberately. History is not a collection of dates and names. It is a manual for understanding power and for learning how to resist it. Before we close, there is one final ritual for you, not of blood, but of intent. To seal this descent, to mark your awakening, type in the comments, "I walk with clarity," twice. Once for the truths you now see, once for the strength you are ready to wield. This is not idle participation. This is your declaration that you will no longer accept illusions without scrutiny. You are no longer a passive observer. You have descended and the knowledge has marked you. Isaac the butcher is gone, but his act survives in the pattern he revealed. The pitons are dust, but the lesson endures. Power, no matter how ritualized, calculated, or fortified, can be undone by clarity, patience, and courage. And now the mantle passes to you. You are the witness, the inheritor of forbidden knowledge, and the man who can see through illusions the world insists are permanent. Remember, systems thrive on silence, but knowledge moves like fire through the cracks. The descent is complete, but the journey, your awakening, has only begun. Isaac carved freedom in the dark. The question is, will you carve yours in the light?